She's a pawn, Marcus. A necessary piece on a very volatile board. David's voice bled through the crack in the heavy oak doors, stripping the warmth from the hallway. The council demanded a union to stabilize the Eastern Pax. Elisa fulfills the treaty's parameters. Do not mistake political duty for affection. Elisa's breath caught in her throat, a jagged shard of glass tearing at her chest. She pressed a trembling hand over her stomach, where a tiny, secret heartbeat fluttered. The heir he didn't know existed. The child of a pawn. The heavy silence that followed his words was a death sentence to the life she thought they were building. Slowly, soundlessly, she backed away into the shadows. She had to run. The marble floors of the royal corridor, usually a canvas of golden afternoon light, felt like a sheet of ice beneath Elisa's feet. She didn't run. Running would draw the attention of the king's guard stationed at the end of the hall. Instead, she let her posture fall into the quiet, unassuming grace that the council had so praised when they selected her. A docile, agreeable Luna. A perfectly molded puzzle piece designed to fit a political void. Her mind, however, was a deafening roar of static. Political duty, not affection. The words played on a relentless loop, syncing with the frantic, erratic thumping of her own heart. Just hours ago, she had stood in the lavishly appointed bathroom of their shared suite, staring at the two pink lines on a plastic stick. She had spent the entire morning agonizing over how to tell him. She had imagined his rough, calloused hands. Hands that had touched her with such deceiving tenderness under the cover of night, resting over her womb. She had woven a beautiful, fragile tapestry of a family, only for David to set it ablaze with a single, casual sentence in a room full of old, calculating men. Slipping past the heavy mahogany doors of their private wing, Elisa locked the deadbolt behind her. The click was a deafening finality. The suite was suffocatingly beautiful, draped in deep emerald silks and smelling faintly of David's signature scent, cedarwood and rain. It was the scent that used to lull her to sleep, the scent she had buried her face against when the pressure of the court grew too heavy. Now, it smelled like a trap. She moved with a cold, terrifying efficiency. There was no time for tears. Tears were a luxury for women who were safe. She dragged a nondescript leather duffel bag from the back of the walk-in closet, a relic from her life before she was thrust into the glittering cage of the monarchy. What does a pawn take when she leaves the board? She bypassed the velvet-lined drawers, holding the ancestral diamonds. She ignored the silk gowns that had been custom-tailored to make her look like a queen. Instead, she packed thick wool sweaters, durable denim, and comfortable boots. She took her passport, an old driver's license from her days in the outer territories, and every stack of loose cash she had squirreled away from her personal allowance over the past 8 months. Her hands only began to shake when she stood before the vanity mirror. She looked at her reflection. She looked pale, her dark eyes wide and haunted, her skin lacking the usual flush of the bond. Her gaze dropped to her left hand. The Luna's ring, a massive, flawless sapphire surrounded by diamonds, felt like a shackle cutting off her circulation. With deliberate slowness, she twisted the ring off her finger. It left a faint red indentation on her skin. She placed it dead center on the glass vanity top. A silent resignation. I am not a piece on your board anymore, David. She placed a protective hand over her lower abdomen. The child inside her was no larger than a seed, yet it was already the center of her universe. The council would take the baby. If they knew she carried the Alpha King's heir, they would lock her in a gilded tower until the child was born. And then they would raise it to be as cold and calculating as Marcus. As cold as David. I won't let them have you, she whispered. the promise vibrating through her chest. Elisa knew the castle better than the guards realized. During the long, lonely weeks when David was away on diplomatic missions, she had memorized the blueprints in the royal library. She knew about the servants' passage behind the tapestries in the East Wing, a narrow, dusty stone staircase used centuries ago. Throwing the duffel strap over her shoulder, she slipped a heavy wool cloak over her shoulders, pulling the hood deep over her face. Outside, the sky had bruised into a dark, violent purple, and the first heavy drops of a torrential downpour began to lash against the reinforced glass windows. The storm was a gift. It would wash away her scent. She navigated the hidden staircase in pitch blackness, feeling the damp stone walls with her fingertips. Every creak of the floorboards above sounded like a snarling wolf to her hyper-alert senses. When she finally pushed open the iron grate at the bottom, she stepped out into the muddy, rain-slicked grounds near the service garages. The groundskeeper's old, battered truck sat parked by the greenhouse, the keys famously left in the ignition by a man too old to care about protocol. Elisa climbed into the cab, the smell of damp earth and stale tobacco offering a bizarre sense of comfort. She turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. As she drove through the service gates, the rain hammering against the windshield in relentless sheets, she allowed herself one final glance in the rearview mirror. The castle loomed against the lightning-scarred sky, a fortress of secrets and lies. She pressed her foot hard on the accelerator, driving into the dark, vanishing into the storm. The air in the council chamber was thick enough to choke on. Alpha King David sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his jaw clenched so tightly his molars ached. For 3 hours, he had endured the thinly veiled threats and condescending advice of the 5 elders. They picked at his borders, they picked at his trade agreements. But mostly they picked at her. She is too quiet. Elder Marcus had sneered, swirling a glass of amber liquid. The packs need a Luna who commands fear, David, not a frightened doe you scooped out of the provincial territories to satisfy a piece of parchment. It took every ounce of David's immense, terrifying control not to vault across the table and rip Marcus's throat out. His wolf clawed at the inside of his ribs, a violent, possessive beast that demanded blood for the disrespect shown to its mate. But David was a king before he was a wolf. The Eastern packs were on the brink of rebellion. If the council sensed for a single second that Elisa was his weakness, that he loved her with a desperate, all-consuming fervor that defied logic, they would use her against him. They would target her. So, he had played the game. He had leaned back, masked his aura in ice, and delivered the lie that would keep her safe. She's a pawn, Marcus. Nothing more. He had said the words to deflect their venom, to render her invisible to their political machinations. It was a calculated risk. A verbal shield. Meeting adjourned. David finally rumbled, standing up abruptly. He didn't wait for the elders to rise. He turned on his heel, his heavy boots echoing like gunshots against the stone floor. The oppressive atmosphere of the chamber peeled away the further he walked down the corridors toward the royal wing. With every step, the ice he had carefully constructed began to melt. He needed her. He needed the soft, grounding scent of jasmine and vanilla. He needed the way she looked at him when the doors were locked, not as a terrifying alpha, but just as David. He wanted to bury his face in her neck, inhale her scent, and wash away the filth of the council's politics. He rounded the corner to their suite. The 2 royal guards snapped to attention, their armor clinking. Has anyone disturbed the Luna? David asked, his hand resting on the intricate brass door handle. No, my king. She has not requested anything. The guard on the left replied rigidly. David nodded, turning the handle and stepping into the suite. Elisa, he called out, his voice instantly shedding its rough command, softening into a velvet murmur. "The meeting is over. Thank the goddess." Silence answered him. The suite was dark, lit only by the sporadic flashes of lightning from the storm outside. A cold draft swept through the room, making the heavy silk curtains billow like ghosts. David's brow furrowed. He inhaled deeply, his enhanced senses reaching out for her. Jasmine, vanilla. But beneath it, a sharp, metallic tang. Fear. And beneath the fear, an acidic edge of profound, soul-crushing heartbreak. The scent of her distress was stale, hours old. "Elisa!" His voice was louder this time, edged with a sudden, primal panic. He strode through the sitting area, pushing open the doors to the bathroom, the library, the balcony. Empty. He moved to the bedroom, throwing the lights on. The bed was perfectly made. He walked toward the walk-in closet, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it never did on a battlefield. He pulled the doors open. Her grand dresses hung perfectly in their garment bags, but the space where she kept her simple, everyday clothes was bare. Her heavy winter boots were gone. The old leather duffel she had brought with her on her first day was missing. "No. No." David backed out of the closet, his breathing turning shallow. His eyes scanned the room, desperate for an explanation, a note, a sign that she was just walking the gardens. Then, his gaze landed on the vanity mirror. Sitting in the exact center of the glass, catching the overhead light, was the Luna's ring. A low, guttural sound ripped from David's throat, a sound that was neither human nor fully wolf. It was the sound of a soul fracturing. He lunged at the vanity, his large hand shaking violently as he picked up the ring. It was cold. She'd been gone for hours. Why? Why would she leave? They had been fine. Just last night, she had fallen asleep against his chest, her fingers tangled in his shirt. What had changed? His mind raced, reconstructing the day. The breakfast they shared, his departure to the council wing, the closed-door meeting with Marcus. The doors, David froze, the ring biting into his palm as he clenched his fist. The heavy oak doors of the council chamber. He had heightened hearing. He knew sound traveled. He had told Marcus she was a pawn. He had said his heart wasn't part of the treaty. He had said it to protect her from the council's blade, never realizing he was driving his own dagger directly into her chest. She heard me. The realization crashed down on him with the weight of a collapsing mountain. She had heard the man she loved reduce her to a political transaction. The doors to the suite burst open as the two guards rushed in, drawn by the Alpha's devastating roar of anguish. They stopped dead in their tracks, their faces paling at the sight of their king. David was on his knees before the vanity, his head bowed, the massive muscles in his back trembling as the storm raged relentlessly against the glass. "Lock down the borders," David whispered, his voice a ragged, terrifying rasp. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes glowing a lethal, luminescent gold. "Summon the trackers. No one sleeps until my wife is found." 3 months later. The coastal town of Blackwood Hollow was a place where secrets went to drown. Perched on the jagged cliffs of the Pacific Northwest, it was a town perpetually choked by gray mist and relentless, freezing rain. The smell of rotting seaweed, diesel fuel, and damp pine was so overpowering that it rendered a werewolf's enhanced olfactory senses practically useless. It was the perfect place for a ghost to hide. Elisa, now known to the locals as Elena, wiped down the sticky laminate counter of the Rusty Anchor diner for the 3rd time. The diner smelled heavily of burnt coffee and fried fish, a foul combination that made her stomach churn, though she welcomed the nausea. The overpowering grease was the best camouflage money could buy. She paused, pressing a damp towel against the back of her neck, and let out a slow exhale. Underneath her oversized, stained flannel shirt and the heavy canvas apron, her stomach formed a distinct, undeniable curve. 5 months. The baby was growing fast, strong, and active. Just moments ago, a sharp little kick against her ribs had nearly made her drop a stack of ceramic mugs. Every time the baby moved, a bittersweet pang echoed in her chest. It was a constant reminder of the life she had fled, and the terrifying, beautiful responsibility she now carried alone. She had survived the first trimester through sheer adrenaline and the cash she had smuggled out. She lived in a cramped, drafty room above a bait shop, paid her rent in untraceable bills, and scrubbed her skin daily with harsh, pine-scented soap to mask the faint, lingering sweetness of her natural scent. She was exhausted, but she was free. The brass bell above the diner's heavy glass door chimed, cutting through the low hum of the refrigerator and the clatter of the rain. Elisa didn't look up immediately. She continued wiping the counter, moving toward the back kitchen. But then, the air in the diner shifted. The atmospheric pressure seemed to drop. The hairs on the back of Elisa's arms stood up, a primal instinct flaring instantly to life. She took a discreet, shallow breath through her nose. Beneath the overwhelming stench of the diner, she caught it. Copper, wet earth, and the distinct, sharp tang of ozone that accompanied an apex predator. A lichen. Her blood turned to ice. She didn't freeze. Survival training, both instinctual and learned in the treacherous halls of the royal court, took over. She slipped seamlessly behind the swinging wooden door of the kitchen, pulling it shut just enough to peer through the narrow circular window. A man had stepped up to the counter. He was tall, built like a brick wall, wearing a dark, expensive trench coat that looked absurdly out of place among the flannel-clad fishermen occupying the booths. He didn't look at the menu. His eyes, a sharp, unnatural shade of amber, scanned the room with predatory calculation. It was Silas, one of David's elite trackers, the king's personal hound. Elisa pressed a hand over her mouth to muffle her breathing. Her heart was beating so violently, she feared Silas could hear it from the front of the house. Why was he here? How had he tracked her through the storm, across state lines, into a neutral, human-dense territory? Coffee. Black. Silas rumbled as old man Jenkins, the diner's owner, hobbled up to the register. "Coming right up, stranger. Nasty weather to be passing through," Jenkins said, pouring the sludge into a paper cup. "You lost?" "Looking for someone," Silas said, his voice flat, devoid of human warmth. He reached into the inner pocket of his trench coat and pulled out a sleek tablet. He tapped the screen and slid it across the counter toward Jenkins. A woman. Dark hair, brown eyes, about 5'5". She would have arrived in the area roughly 3 months ago. Elisa closed her eyes, pressing her back against the cold stainless steel refrigerator in the kitchen. She grabbed a handful of raw coffee grounds from a nearby bin and rubbed them frantically onto her neck and wrists, desperate to bury any microscopic trace of her jasmine scent. Jenkins squinted at the screen. Elisa's chest tightened. If Jenkins recognized her, if he pointed to the back room, she wouldn't even have time to make it to the alley door. Silas was too fast. "Pretty girl," Jenkins muttered. "But we get a lot of drifters up this way. Transients looking for cannery work. Face doesn't ring a bell. You a cop?" "Private security," Silas lied smoothly. He took the coffee, leaving a $100 bill on the counter. He didn't ask for change. "If she comes through, call the number on the screen. There's a $50,000 reward for information leading to her safe return. 50,000. A fortune for anyone in this town. Elisa's stomach plummeted. David wasn't just looking for her. He was tearing the world apart to drag his pawn back to the board. Silas turned toward the door, but paused. He tilted his head slightly, his nostrils flaring as he took a deep breath of the diner's stagnant air. Elisa stopped breathing completely. Her hand instinctively shielded her rounded belly. For 3 agonizing seconds, Silas stood frozen, his predatory senses sifting through the grease, the fish, and the rain. Then the bell chimed again as a group of loud, wet loggers barged in, overwhelming the space with the smell of wet dog and cheap beer. Silas's focus broke. He pushed past them and disappeared into the storm. Elisa let out a ragged, silent sob, sliding down the refrigerator until she hit the linoleum floor. She was safe for the moment, but the illusion of Blackwood Hollow was shattered. Silas was in the town. David's net was closing in. She looked down at her stomach, her jaw setting in a fierce, terrified line. She couldn't stay here tonight. She had to run again. But this time, she was running out of places to hide. The room above the bait shop was little more than a slanted roof and a cot. But for 3 months, it had been a sanctuary. Now, it felt like a trap waiting to spring. Elisa burst through the flimsy plywood door, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The baby, agitated by her sudden spike in adrenaline, rolled heavily against her ribs, sending a sharp ache through her abdomen. "I know, little one, I know." "We have to go," she whispered, her hands flying methodically across the tiny space. She abandoned the few comforts she had acquired, a thick quilt, a small space heater, and shoved only her remaining cash, her false identification, and 2 changes of clothes into her leather duffel. Silas was a bloodhound, a rare lichen genetic offshoot whose tracking abilities were legendary. If he was in Blackwood Hollow, he was already sweeping the grid. The diner had bought her minutes, not hours. She couldn't use the bus terminal. That was the first place a tracker would lock down. She couldn't buy a car. The registration process, even forged, left a digital footprint David's tech division would instantly flag. There was only one way out of a town, wedged between impassable mountains and the ocean, the harbor. Elisa pulled her wool hood down, stepping out into the torrential freezing rain. The storm that had been her ally on the night she fled the capital was now a brutal adversary, chilling her to the bone. She navigated the back alleys, slipping on slick cobblestones, her arm wrapped protectively around her swollen belly. The docks were a chaotic symphony of groaning wood, crashing waves, and shouting deckhands. Commercial fishing vessels were making their final preparations to beat the worst of the incoming gale. Elisa zeroed in on a rusted, hulking trawler named the Iron Maiden. It was an unregulated, independent vessel, the kind that dealt in cash and asked 0 questions. She approached the captain, a grizzled, imposing man shouting orders over the roar of a diesel engine. "I need passage to Seattle," Elisa shouted, her voice trembling but her gaze unyielding. The captain looked her up and down, taking in her drenched clothes and the undeniable curve of her pregnancy. He scoffed, wiping oil from his hands. "We ain't a passenger ferry, sweetheart. It's a rough ride. Not a place for a woman in your condition. Insurance liability." Elisa didn't argue. She unzipped the top pocket of her duffel, pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills, and shoved them against his chest. 3,000. Cash. I'll sleep in the cargo hold. You never saw me. The captain stared at the money, then at her desperate, haunted eyes. The unspoken rule of the docks was survival, and $3,000 covered a lot of fuel. He snatched the bills, tucking them into his heavy coat. Bottom deck, past the ice machines. Keep out of my crew's way, and if you go into labor, you're on your own." Elisa nodded quickly, scrambling up the wet metal gangway. She descended into the dark, freezing bowels of the ship. The stench of raw fish, ammonia, and diesel was suffocating. But it was perfect. No wolf, not even Silas, could trace a scent through this biohazard of odors. She huddled in a dark corner behind a stack of empty crates, pulling her knees to her chest as the massive engines vibrated to life. Above deck, the crew yelled for the mooring lines to be cast off. Suddenly, a heavy rhythmic thud echoed on the metal decking above. Elisa's blood ran cold. The vibration wasn't a deckhand's boot. It was the heavy, calculated stride of an apex predator. Silas. "Harbor Master says you're leaving early, Captain." Silas's deep, emotionless voice bled through the grated ceiling directly above Elisa's head. "Storm's turning. Gotta beat the swells," the captain grunted. "State your business, stranger. We're casting off. Looking for a runaway. Dark hair, brown eyes. Might be trying to buy her way off the grid." Elisa pressed her hands over her mouth, squeezing her eyes shut. She was trapped in a steel box. If Silas stepped down into the hold, there was nowhere to run. She forced her heart rate to slow, employing the deep breathing meditative techniques David had taught her to calm her anxiety during council galas. The memory of his hands guiding her breath felt like a physical blow. "Ain't seen no girls, pretty or otherwise," the captain replied, his voice gruff. "Just my ugly crew. Now get off my deck before I have my boys toss you overboard. I got crab quotas to meet." A torturous silence stretched above. Elisa could picture Silas, his amber eyes scanning the deck, his nostrils flaring. But the combination of the freezing rain, the overwhelming stench of the catch, and the captain's aggressive human ignorance was an impenetrable wall. "Safe travels," Silas finally murmured. The heavy thud of his boots retreated down the gangway. A moment later, the trawler lurched forward, pulling away from the dock. Elisa collapsed against the freezing steel wall, trembling violently as the boat pitched into the unforgiving sea. She had survived. But the cost was a piece of her soul, chipped away by the relentless terror of being hunted. The royal palace of the Eastern Pax was supposed to be a beacon of strength and prosperity. Instead, over the last 3 months, it had become a mausoleum. Alpha King David stood in his private study, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling, manicured gardens. The glass reflected a man who was unraveling. He had lost weight, his cheekbones sharp and hollow. His usually pristine beard was overgrown, and his eyes, once a commanding, steady gold, were bloodshot, rimmed with the deep purple of chronic insomnia. He hadn't slept a full night since he found her ring on the vanity. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. He smelled the phantom scent of jasmine and vanilla lingering in the linens, a cruel trick of his grieving wolf. The heavy oak doors behind him swung open, breaking the silence. "I explicitly ordered the guard not to permit entry," David rumbled, not bothering to turn around. His voice was a low, dangerous growl that would have sent a lesser wolf fleeing. "The guards are terrified of you, David. I am not," Elder Marcus replied, stepping into the room. He leaned heavily on his silver-tipped cane, his expression a mask of cold condescension. "You are neglecting your duties. The Riverbend Pack is threatening to withhold their tithes, and border skirmishes in the north have doubled. The packs are restless. They smell their alpha's weakness." David finally turned. The air in the room instantly dropped by 10 degrees, thick with a suffocating, dominant aura that made the glass panes rattle. "Watch your tone, Marcus. I will not." Marcus snapped, slamming his cane against the floor. You are tearing this kingdom apart for a girl. We brought her here to be a diplomatic bridge, and she proved herself unstable. Good riddance, I say. It is time to officially dissolve the union in absentia and select a new Luna. The daughter of the Northern Alpha is of age. Before Marcus could finish the sentence, David moved. He was a blur of lethal, unbridled violence. In a fraction of a second, his massive hand was wrapped around Marcus's throat, lifting the elder off the floor and slamming him against the mahogany bookshelf. Ancient tomes crashed to the floor, but David didn't blink. His claws extended, pricking the fragile skin of the elder's neck. Say another word about replacing her, David hissed, his wolf bleeding into his voice, his eyes glowing a blinding, feral gold. Say it, and I will rip your throat out and mail it to the Northern Alpha as a warning. Marcus choked, his hands clawing uselessly at David's immovable grip. Fear, true, unadulterated terror, finally pierced the old man's arrogance. She is my mate, David growled, leaning in so close Marcus could feel the heat of his rage. Not a pawn, not a diplomatic bridge. Mine. And until she is back in my arms, the council will manage the borders, or they will burn. Do you understand me? Marcus managed a pathetic, breathless nod. David released him in disgust. The elder crumpled to the floor, gasping for air, rubbing his bruised neck as he scrambled out of the room like a frightened rat. David stood amidst the fallen books, his chest heaving, his hands trembling with the effort it took not to finish the kill. He was losing control. Without his mate to anchor him, the primal, violent instincts of his lichen blood were overriding his humanity. The encrypted cell phone on his desk vibrated, a harsh, buzzing interruption. David snatched it, pressing it to his ear. Only 3 people had this number. Speak. It's Silas. The voice crackled through the secure line. I found a trail. David's heart stopped. The crushing weight that had sat on his chest for 90 days fractured. Where? A coastal town, Blackwood Hollow. A diner owner matched her description, operating under the name Elena. I caught a microscopic trace of her scent on the back door. Silas paused, the sound of howling wind bleeding through the speaker. But I lost her. She made it to the docks before I could lock on. The storm washed the rest away. I'm reviewing harbor security footage now, but half the cameras are dead from the weather. She was there, David breathed, running a trembling hand through his hair. A bizarre mixture of overwhelming relief and terrifying desperation flooded his veins. She was alive. She was out there. Do you want me to mobilize the regional packs to sweep the coastline? Silas asked. No, David said instantly. Involving the regional packs meant involving the council. If the council found her first, they would lock her in a secure facility and use her to leverage his compliance. He wouldn't let them near her. Recall your men. Fall back to the capital. Alpha, we have the scent. If we stop now, I said fall back, Silas. David's voice was absolute, stripping away the feral madness and replacing it with lethal, cold precision. He walked toward his closet, pulling down a heavy, tactical jacket. I'm coming out there. I will hunt her down myself. Seattle was a sprawling labyrinth of concrete, neon, and perpetual drizzle. For a fugitive, it was perfect. There were millions of heartbeats, millions of overlapping scents, and an endless network of subterranean human activity. It had been 6 weeks since Elisa escaped Blackwood Hollow. She was now approaching her 7th month of pregnancy, and the physical toll was becoming impossible to ignore. She had found a cash-in-hand job sweeping floors at an all-night laundromat and rented a tiny, damp basement apartment in a neglected neighborhood. But hiding was no longer her biggest problem. The baby was. Elisa sat on the edge of an examination table in a dimly lit, underground medical clinic that catered to those who couldn't afford questions. The paper beneath her crinkled as she adjusted her posture, trying to ease the sharp, burning ache in her lower back. Dr. Aris, a tired-looking human physician with graying hair and a stained white coat, frowned as he stared at the grainy black and white monitor of the portable ultrasound machine. The rhythmic whoosh, whoosh, whoosh of the baby's heartbeat filled the small room. "I don't understand," Dr. Aris muttered, adjusting the transducer on Elisa's gel-slicked belly. He tapped the screen. "Elena, are you absolutely certain about your dates? You said you are 26 weeks. "Yes," Elisa lied smoothly. She was exactly 28 weeks, but lichen pregnancies accelerated in the third trimester. "Well, the bone density imaging here is highly irregular," the doctor said, his brow furrowing deeper. The femur length and cranial development look closer to 34 weeks. And the heart rate? It's resting at 190 beats per minute. That's dangerously tachycardic for a human fetus. Elisa's blood chilled. For a human fetus? "Is the baby in distress?" she asked, keeping her voice level. Though her hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly, her knuckles turned white. That's the strange part. There are no signs of distress. The blood flow is incredibly strong. "Abnormally strong," Dr. Aris muttered, pulling a medical journal from a nearby counter. "I want to draw some blood. We need to run genetic markers. This level of accelerated cellular growth could indicate a severe mutation or..." "No." Elisa sat up abruptly, grabbing a paper towel to wipe the cold gel from her stomach. "No needles, no tests. We're fine. Elena, please listen to me. If there is a chromosomal anomaly, you need a specialist. This clinic isn't equipped." "How much do I owe you for the ultrasound?" She interrupted, her voice hardening with the authority of a Luna she thought she had left behind. She pulled her oversized sweater down, her protective instincts flaring. The doctor sighed, recognizing a wall he couldn't break. $50. "But I strongly advise..." Elisa tossed a crumpled $50 bill onto the counter and walked out the door before he could finish. The Seattle air was biting as she stepped out of the clinic into a narrow, trash-strewn alleyway. The rain had paused, leaving a thick, suffocating fog rolling off the Puget Sound. She hugged her coat tightly around her protruding stomach, her mind racing. The baby was developing too fast. The lichen traits were manifesting strongly, and she had no pack doctor to guide her, no safe place to give birth without raising alarms. She took 3 steps down the alley before a terrifying realization hit her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The air suddenly felt dense, vibrating with a low, oppressive frequency. She stopped. The shadows at the end of the alley shifted. A man stepped into the dim light of a flickering street lamp. He was disheveled, his clothes torn and stained with grime. But it was his eyes that made Elisa's heart stop. They were glowing a sickly, pale yellow. A rogue. A wolf without a pack, driven half-mad by isolation. He wasn't looking at her face. He was staring directly at her stomach, his head tilted as if listening to a song only he could hear. "I smelled it 3 blocks away," the rogue hissed, taking a slow, predatory step forward. His voice was a wet, guttural rasp. "I thought I was hallucinating. The aura, it's suffocating." Elisa backed up, her hand instinctively reaching for the heavy pepper spray in her pocket. A pathetic defense against a werewolf. But it was all she had. "Get away from me." A human carrying a wolf. The rogue laughed, a broken, terrifying sound. No, not just a wolf. I can feel the dominance pressing on my lungs. You're carrying an alpha, a pure blood. Elisa's breath hitched. The baby wasn't just developing quickly. As the heir to the strongest alpha king on the continent, the child's dormant power was waking up. The baby was emitting a latent lichen aura, a scentless, energetic beacon that any sensitive wolf nearby could feel. She wasn't just hiding herself anymore. She was carrying a lighthouse in the dark. An alpha pup. The rogue sneered, his claws extending with a sickening snick as he crouched, his muscles coiling to spring. Do you know what the black market would pay for royal blood? Or what the rival packs would give to extinguish David's line before it's born? Elisa pressed her back against the damp brick wall of the clinic. There was nowhere to run. The horrifying truth crashed down upon her. David wasn't the only monster hunting her, and without him, she had absolutely no way to protect his child. The rogue's muscles coiled like thick, rusted springs beneath his ruined clothes. He didn't see a woman. He saw a prize, a biological gold mine that could buy him his way back into a pack, or at the very least, fund a lifetime of oblivion. Elisa didn't wait for him to strike. Survival instinct, honed by 6 months of solitary terror, overrode her paralyzing fear. As the rogue lunged, his jaw unhinging to reveal a set of lethal, yellowed fangs, Elisa thrust her arm forward and depressed the trigger of the heavy-duty pepper spray directly into his eyes. A stream of caustic orange liquid hit the wolf's face. The rogue shrieked, a horrifying, high-pitched sound that echoed off the damp brick walls. He thrashed blindly, his massive claws raking through the empty air. One heavily muscled arm caught Elisa's shoulder, a glancing blow, but with the force of a battering ram. The impact lifted her off her feet. She twisted mid-air, throwing her arms over her stomach to take the brunt of the fall on her back and shoulder. She hit the wet asphalt hard. The breath vanished from her lungs in a sharp, agonizing hiss. "You bitch!" The rogue roared, rubbing his burning eyes, his vision clearing just enough to lock onto her form writhing on the ground. He took a heavy, murderous step toward her. "I'll carve the pup out myself." Elisa scrambled backward, the rough gravel tearing at the palms of her hands. She couldn't breathe. The baby kicked violently against her ribs, sensing its mother's mortal panic. This was the end. After everything, she was going to die in a filthy alleyway. Her child stolen by a monster. Then, the atmospheric pressure in the alley simply ceased to exist. It was as if all the oxygen had been sucked into a vacuum. The flickering street lamp overhead burst in a shower of sparks, plunging the space into near-total darkness. A low, vibrating hum resonated through the concrete beneath Elisa's hands, a frequency so deep and terrible it rattled her teeth. The rogue froze, the feral madness draining from his posture in a fraction of a second. He whirled around, staring toward the mouth of the alley. He didn't snarl. He whimpered. A silhouette detached itself from the thick Seattle fog. David didn't walk. He stalked. He was no longer a king in a tailored suit. He was a primordial force of nature, his aura rolling off him in suffocating, invisible waves of pure, undiluted lichen dominance. His eyes were not their usual amber. They were burning, luminescent gold, shedding actual light into the darkness. "Alpha," the rogue choked out, taking a stumbling step backward. He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling. I didn't know she was yours. I just smelled the pup." David didn't speak. He moved faster than human eyes could track. There was a sickening, wet crunch. Elisa clamped her hands over her ears and squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't want to see. She didn't want the image of the violence to burn into her brain. A heavy thud followed, and then absolute terrifying silence, save for the rhythmic patter of the rain starting to fall again. Elisa. The voice was a ragged, broken gasp. The monstrous aura evaporated instantly, replaced by the familiar, heartbreaking scent of cedarwood and rain. Elisa opened her eyes. David was kneeling 2 feet away from her. The rogue was gone, a crumpled mass of shadows near the dumpsters. David's hands, stained with blood, hovered in the air between them, trembling so violently he looked as though he were freezing to death. He took in her disheveled hair, the scrape on her cheek, the terror in her wide brown eyes. And then, his gaze dropped to her stomach. The oversized sweater had ridden up during the fall, clearly revealing the undeniable, heavy curve of her 7-month pregnancy. David stopped breathing. His golden eyes widened, the fierce alpha completely stripped away, leaving only a stunned, shattered man. He stared at her abdomen as if he were looking at a ghost, at a miracle he couldn't comprehend. "A baby," he whispered, the words barely making it past his lips. "You're carrying my child." He reached out slowly, instinctively, his bloodied hand shaking as it drifted toward the swell of her stomach. Elisa flinched violently, scrambling backward against the cold brick wall. She wrapped her arms protectively over her womb, her eyes flashing with a desperate maternal fury. "Don't touch him. You're not taking him for the council." The word struck David like a physical blow. He reeled back, the color draining from his face. The agony in her voice, the pure, unadulterated terror she held for him, finally broke the king. The interior of the secure penthouse safe house in downtown Seattle was stark, modern, and suffocatingly quiet. The heavy soundproof glass blocked out the chaotic noise of the city below. Elisa sat perched on the edge of a pristine white leather sofa, holding a warm cup of tea she hadn't taken a single sip from. She had allowed David to bring her here only because her adrenaline had crashed, leaving her too physically exhausted to run, and because the protective detail of elite Lycan guards stationed at the doors meant no other rogue would ever get close. David stood on the opposite side of the room, near the unlit fireplace. He had scrubbed the blood from his hands, but the stain of the night still clung to him. He looked ragged. The sharp, commanding alpha king she remembered was gone, replaced by a man hollowed out by months of grief. "Let Dr. Aris come up," David said, his voice a low, gravelly plea. He hadn't moved closer to her since the alley. "Just to check the baby. To make sure the fall didn't—" "We're fine," Elisa said, her voice tight, devoid of emotion. She stared at the swirling surface of her tea. "The baby's Lycan aura is strong. It acts as a physical buffer." He protected himself. David squeezed his eyes shut, a muscle feathering in his jaw. He, a son, an heir. Why, Elisa? The question ripped from his chest, ragged and desperate. "Why did you leave? I tore the continent apart looking for you. I thought you had been kidnapped. I thought you were dead. Why would you run into the cold, pregnant and alone?" Elisa finally looked up. The anger she had carefully banked for 6 months flared to life, burning away her exhaustion. "Because I didn't want to be a piece on your board anymore," she said, her voice trembling but fierce. "I didn't want my child to be raised by a man who saw his mother as nothing more than a necessary treaty parameter." David froze, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What are you talking about?" "I heard you, David." A single tear escaped, cutting a hot path down her cheek. 3 months ago, outside the council chambers. I was coming to tell you about the baby. And I heard you tell Marcus that I was just a pawn, that there was no affection, just political duty. The silence that followed was absolute. David stared at her, the blood rushing from his head. The memory of that wretched meeting crashed over him. The sneering faces of the elders, the thinly veiled threats against her life, if she proved to be a distraction. Slowly, David's legs gave out. He sank to his knees on the hardwood floor, the physical distance between them suddenly feeling like an ocean. He buried his face in his hands, a jagged, agonizing sob tearing from his throat. Elisa stiffened. She had never seen David cry. Not when his father died, not during the border wars. The sheer, naked devastation in his response unnerved her. "Elisa," he gasped, lifting his head. His eyes were red, overflowing with unshed tears. "You heard the shield, not the sword." She frowned, her grip tightening on the mug. "What? The council hates you," David said, his voice cracking. "They hate that you aren't from a pure, aristocratic bloodline. Marcus wanted you gone. He was pushing to have you removed, permanently. The only thing keeping you alive in that castle was their belief that you were a tool I controlled." He crawled forward, stopping just short of her knees, looking up at her with a vulnerability that stripped away every lie they had ever lived. "If they knew you were my heart," he whispered, his voice breaking. "If they knew that I loved you so completely, so desperately, that I would burn the entire Eastern Territory to the ground just to keep you warm. They would have used you to break me. They would have assassinated you." Elisa stopped breathing. The teacup trembled in her hands. "I lied to them to protect you," David confessed, his tears finally falling. "I called you a pawn to make them look away from you. And in doing so, I drove you into the dark. I almost killed you both." The moral weight of his confession hung heavy in the air. The toxic Game of Thrones had demanded a sacrifice, and David had offered up his own truth, never realizing the collateral damage it would inflict on the woman he was trying to save. Elisa stared at the broken king kneeling before her. The cold, icy wall she had built around her heart over the last 6 months cracked, the bitter resentment melting under the blinding heat of his agonizing truth. The silence stretched, no longer toxic, but profoundly healing. Elisa slowly set the teacup on the glass coffee table. She looked down at David, seeing past the crown, past the alpha, straight to the man who had torn himself apart to keep her safe. She reached out, her hand trembling, and brushed her fingertips against his overgrown beard. He leaned into her touch instantly, closing his eyes, a shuddering breath escaping his lungs. "You should have told me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You shouldn't have carried the politics alone. You made me believe my love was a burden." "I was arrogant," David admitted, turning his face to press a desperate, lingering kiss against the palm of her hand. "I thought I could manage the monsters. I thought I could keep the filth of the council away from you. I was wrong, Elisa. I was so arrogant, and I paid for it every single second you were gone." Right at that moment, the baby shifted. It was a strong, sharp kick, visibly moving the fabric of Elisa's sweater. David's eyes snapped open. He stared at her abdomen, a mixture of profound awe and deep, instinctual reverence washing over his features. He looked up at her, a silent, pleading question in his eyes. Elisa gave a small, tearful nod. Slowly, carefully, David moved his large hand, resting it gently against the swell of her stomach. The warmth of his touch was a jarring contrast to the cold months she had endured. A second later, the baby kicked again, directly against his palm. David gasped, a wet, breathless laugh escaping his lips. He is so strong. His aura. It's blinding, Elisa. He's been developing too fast, she admitted, the lingering fear from the clinic surfacing. The doctor said his lichen traits are accelerating. He is an alpha heir. He senses the danger. He's trying to grow fast enough to protect his mother. David murmured, his thumb gently stroking her stomach. He looked up at her, his golden eyes solidifying with a new, terrifying resolve. But he won't have to anymore. I am here. The storm that had chased Elisa into the dark had finally broken, leaving behind a hard, undeniable clarity. She had run to escape a cage, only to discover that her true freedom lay not in hiding, but in dismantling the very system that threatened her family. Standing beside David, feeling the strong, steady heartbeat of their unborn heir between them, she was no longer a pawn. She was the Luna, and together they were returning to the capital, not to play the game, but to flip the board entirely. The Council's reign of shadows was over. The era of the true Alpha had begun. Thank you for reading this thrilling, dramatic journey. If you felt the tension and loved the twists in David and Elisa's story, please drop a like, share this tale with your fellow romance and drama lovers, and subscribe for more pulse-pounding, emotional stories.